Chapter 3 Sonya and a Problem. The island on which our cabin stands has only about 3 acres of land. It rests in the southwest portion of a moderate sized lake. This is one of a chain of 28 lakes connected by navigable channels. Both people and animals often call our island, and we never know who or what our guests will be. I was sitting at my desk writing one morning when I heard the softest little tapping sound near our door. At first, I thought it was a downy woodpecker working on a nearby tree. When the sound was repeated, however, it was right at the door. It is not usual for a woodpecker to drum on our house, so as I went to the door, I expected to see one of these valuable and beautiful birds fly away. But no bird was there, nor could I see anything else that might have produced such a sound. Puzzled, I returned to my work. A moment later, the tapping was repeated. No mistake about it, the sound was at the door. It came again, 7 dainty but distinct taps. Jenny heard it too and went to the door. She found nothing. I stood near the closed door, determined to find out what was making that strange noise. Woodpeckers don't go around playing Halloween tricks, and I could think of no other creature that would or could be doing it. Something had to be there. Knocks don't go around knocking just by themselves. I didn't have long to wait. Presently, tap, 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 tap came in rapid succession. I jerked the door open quickly to see this, whatever it was, before it got away. There I looked into a startled face of a little girl about 8 or 9 years old. She was a beautiful child with very dark eyes, camel like features against a black background of long black curls. Apparently, my sudden appearance had startled her, for she stood like a statue. One hand was still raised, the other fingers folded to tap, and she had just drawn in a deep breath that had to last a long time. Finally, she managed to gasp out a little, "Oh!" "Bless your heart, child, did I frighten you?" I asked, though the answer was obvious. "I'm sorry." She kept staring at me, uncertain whether to run or not. "Are you Mr. Campbell?" She divided my name carefully into Campbell, pronouncing every syllable in a clear, precise manner, usually unusual in one of her years. "Yes, I'm Mr. Campbell," I said. "And what is your name?" She relaxed now. Her 2 feet got pointed in the same direction. Her hand dropped to her side, and a lovely smile pushed two dimples into her cheeks. "Sonya," she said clearly, and then swallowed hard. "Sonya, how nice." I took her hands in mine. "Sonya has always been a favorite name of mine. So you were the little woodpecker who's been tapping on my door. Tell me, Sonya, why did you run away?" Her smile faded. She seemed unable to answer. "Were you afraid?" I asked. She nodded her head. "Not really afraid, Mr. Campbell," said a voice. I looked up to see a well-dressed man and woman approach the cabin. Down at the water's edge was the boat in which they had come to the island. "Sonya idolizes you. Now she's overwhelmed to be with you," the lady continued. "We're Dorothy and Richard Eck. You have already met our daughter Sonya." Greetings were exchanged, and Jenny came out of the cabin to meet our surprised guests. "We ask your pardon for calling on you without invitation," said Mr. Eck, a tall man with a soft voice and quiet manners. "Sonya just had to see you. In fact, we came all the way from England to call at your sanctuary." "From England?" I said, surprised. "I'm greatly honored." "Well, at least you were one of the reasons that brought us here," Mrs. Eck corrected. She was a most attractive lady and dressed as if She had stepped out of a fashion plate. We've been living in England. It was there we found Sonya. She put her arm around the child and drew her into a strong hug. She needed parents and we needed a child. So we formed a lifelong partnership. It looks like a partnership of love, volunteered Jenny. It is, agreed Mrs. Eck. But to explain our call, Sonya read your books, the English editions. She's practically lived with them ever since. She loves animals. They're her main interest, her greatest enthusiasm. She thinks about them the way you talk of them in your books. She wrote you once from England. Wait a minute, I broke in. Is this the Sonya who wrote me such a nice letter a few months ago? In that lovely handwriting? Yes, it is, Mr. X said, and we marveled that you had time to answer it. If I had known how pretty Sonya is, I think I would have brought the answer over in person, I laughed. Well, ever since receiving it, Sonya was determined to see you. We had decided to move back to America, our native country, but seeing your sanctuary was one of the first things we wanted to do. Now, Sonya, you had something to ask Mr. Campbell. What was it? Sonya had recovered entirely from her shock now. She looked up at Jenny and me, smiled in between two dimples, and said, Is Inky the porcupine real? Yes, he's a very real porcupine. And Salt and Pepper the porcupine's real too? Yes, they're real too. And Sausage the woodchuck, Rack and Ruin the raccoons, Bobette the deer, and she went on to name a long list of animals we have known at the sanctuary. She was assured they were all real animals and that our friendships with them were real too. As we were talking, I heard a nuthatch's call overhead. Sonya, I said, right this minute you're going to meet Pestersome Pete. Ooh, now who is this Pestersome Pete? She said, eyes wide with interest. Pestersome Pete is our nuthatch, our pet nuthatch, I replied. Here, take these peanut crumbs and hold them out in your hand. I'm sure he'll come to you. Pete didn't hesitate. With a little call of Nia, probably the equivalent of whoopee, he flew right up and perched on her fingertips. Sonya gave a gasp of delight. She was fascinated with Pete, and he with her. Instead of snatching a morsel and flying away, he remained on her hand, looking up into her face as much as to say, Where have you been all my life? Sonya said nothing, though her dark, sparkling eyes told something of the joy she was experiencing. I chanced to glance at Mrs. X's face. Her expression was puzzling. Far from showing the happiness I expected, her eyes were shadowed with something closely akin to fear. Her hands closed tightly, and she kept her gaze fixed on Sonya. When Pete at last flew away from Sonya's hand, she whirled about and pressed into her mother's arms. Mother, mother, did you see Pete? She cried. Did you see him? Right on my hand? Yes, yes, I saw him, dear, said her mother, a smile breaking through. You're very happy now, aren't you? There was no question about that. He'll come back, Sonya, I said, giving her more peanut crumbs. Our chickadees will come soon, and they'll light right on your hand. We must not take too much of your time, said Mr. Eck. It's wonderful to be here, and Sonya won't forget it. While she is feeding the birds, could Mrs. Eck talk with you for just about 5 minutes? Of course, I said. Pastor Pete was back on Sonia's willing hand, and Jenny was calling up the chickadees as Mrs. Eck and I stepped a few steps away. I'm afraid you're going to think me very silly, Mr. Campbell. She began speaking hesitantly as if uncertain how to present her subject. I have a problem, a serious one for me. Mr. Eck feels sure you can help me, and I'll be grateful if you can. I'll be happy to Happy if I can be of any service to you, I said. Then, looking back to the group feeding birds where Sonya was squealing with delight, I added, just see the joy that sweet child is getting out of feeding those birds. That's the point, says Mrs. Eck, facing toward them. It's that joy I want to preserve, and my problem is how to do it. I don't quite understand. Mr. Campbell, love for animals is the dominant thing in Sonia's life. She reads about animals, talks about them, dreams about them, thinks about them almost all the time. A wholesome thing, I commented. It will be a source of pleasure all through her life, something that will never fail. Mrs. Eck was silent for a moment, evidently uncertain how to go on. Mr. Campbell, she said seriously, she loves every living thing. It's her nature to do so. The question is, can a person who doesn't like animals learn to love them? Why do you ask? Because, well, frankly, I can't stand animals. Maybe I'm afraid of them, maybe I hate them. I don't know. It isn't just certain kinds of animals. I don't want any of them near me, even that bird. I know he's cute and beautiful and all that, but it made me cringe to be so near him. Shivers like young earthquakes ran all over me. I looked at her incredulously. Is it a so called allergy? I asked. No, at least it doesn't make me ill, only creepy. I've talked to some of my friends who feel that way about snakes, but I'm like that about any animal. It wasn't such a problem before I found Sonya. I was leading a busy life and didn't have animals around me, but now, don't you see, I must overcome this aversion some way, for Sonya has to have animals, and I have to have Sonya. I can't let this be a barrier between us. I must learn to see them as she does. Sonya does have pets, I asked. Mr. Campbell, we now live in a suburb of Chicago. Sonya has brought home frogs, toads, turtles, snakes, worms, puppies, kittens, until I've gone nearly crazy. Animals seem to know my feelings, and they do awful things to me. Sonya was showing me her favorite frog. It took one look at me and then jumped on my shoulder and went down my back inside my dress. I nearly passed out. Sonya thought I was laughing, but I was hysterical. Her dogs bite me. Her cats scratch me. She once had an owl that would just sit and hoot at me. They all know I don't like them. Now, Mr. Campbell, you love animals the way Sonya does. How am I going to learn? What is the secret? I was searching for something to say that would be helpful. Most times I have met people who have no natural love for animals, but as a rule, they have no wish to change their thinking. In fact, this was the first time I had known anyone who actually wanted to conquer the condition. I guess I got a wrong start with animals, Mrs. Eck was saying. At our home, when I was a child, we had no pets, and most of the books I read about wild animals taught how savage they were. Even now, I imagine that bears just go around hugging people, wild cats jump on you out of trees, snakes sneak up on you, eagles carry children away, skunks spray you, rabbits jump at you, wolves bark at you. Wolves don't bark, they howl. I broke in, laughing. Snakes don't sneak, eagles don't snatch children. In fact, rarely is any animal an enemy of a human being. Almost never in this part of the world. Animals quickly sense if anyone is afraid of them because they feel it means hostility. These notions you have are fairy tales. Like ghosts and goblins, they're not true. Your whole problem is the way you're thinking about animals. Surely we ought to be able to correct and read just thoughts that aren't true. I suggest you study animals, get facts about them, learn how intelligent they are, get near to them, and rid yourself of the errors you hold about them. You have a sense of humor about the situation. That will help you tremendously. Perhaps you're right, she said doubtfully. I'll try. We've rented a summer home near here for the season. Would you mind if we came over to your sanctuary to see some of your pet animals once in a while? If you enjoy them the way your books indicate, surely I can learn from watching you. I don't want to be a martyr or suffer while Sonya enjoys her nature pals. I want to be really happy with them. Her next words were emphasized by a stamp of her foot. I vow I'm going to live this season so close to nature I can hear her snore. Mrs. X's eyes narrowed in determined resolve. I doubt I don't want to walk just hand in hand with nature. I want to get my arms around her. I'm going to stay out in the forest so much I'll look like one of the trees. And if I can stand it, I want to get so friendly with animals they will pat me on the back and call me by my first name. Now, please, be frank with me. Would it bother you terribly if we came here occasionally, not only for Sonia's sake, but for mine? I assured her they would be most welcome, requested that their coming be by appointment so as to not interrupt picture taking. I suggested books she might read that would give correct information about animals. Then we went back to the group who were still having fun with the birds. Jenny was feeding chickadees out of both hands. Mr. Eck was tossing peanuts at our pet blue jay and watching him catch them in midair. Sonya was happily bewildered, trying to see all that was going on. Pastor Pete was in the height of his glory. He rushed back and forth until his wing feathers were frazzled, carrying peanut crumbs from Sonia's ever ready hand and storing them under the bark of nearby trees. Every time he returned, Sonya showered him with flattery. "Oh, Pete, you're beautiful, you're lovely, you're wonderful," she exclaimed over and over again. Pete just soaked it up. As I approached, he looked over at me as much as to say, "Listen, old top, and you'll learn how you ought to talk to a bird like me." "May I feed him?" asked Mrs. Eck from between clenched teeth. Please do, Mother," said Sonya. "It's so much fun." Mrs. Eck took some peanut crumbs from Sonya. When she held them out, her hand trembled. She drew her hand back and closed her eyes as if to that she was going to expect that something was going to explode. Pete came sailing in and lighted on her hand. Suddenly, he discovered this wasn't Sonya. Then he did something I have seldom seen nuthatches do. He deliberately hauled off and gave Mrs. X's hand a sharp and painful peck. "Eek!" screamed Mrs. X, jerking her hand away. "Yeah!" yelled Pesterson Pete, sailing away like a jet plane. Chickadees were flying in various directions, and Bluey the Blue Jay headed for the clouds. That was the end of bird feeding for that day. Even the pleading calls of Jenny and Sonya could not get them to return. "You see what I mean?" said Mrs. Eck to me, as the commotion subsided.